The Disingenuous Testimony from Social Psychologists. Richard Leo and other false confession experts, oftentimes social psychologists, have testified that, quote, there is a consensus in the scientific community that the techniques taught by the Reid method sometimes lead to or are involved in false confession cases, and that there is, quote, substantial empirical research that the Reid method can become psychologically coercive, and that the, quote, Reid behavioral interview method has been discredited. Leo describes the Reid behavior analysis interview as the investigator asks 15 or 20 hypothetical questions and evaluates whether the subject is telling the truth or lying based on their answers and body language. And that can become the basis for interrogating somebody, and that has been discredited. So let's take a look at the accuracy of these statements. It should be noted at the outset of this presentation that consistently the courts have concluded that false confessions are not caused by the Reid technique, but are caused by interrogators engaging in coercive behaviors that the courts have ruled to be objectionable, such as threatening inevitable consequences, conducting an excessively long interrogation, making a promise of leniency in return for the confession, denying a subject their rights, denying the suspect the opportunity to satisfy their physical needs, threatening the suspect with a more severe punishment if they don't confess, and physically harming the suspect or threatening to do so. In fact, in one research effort, the author studied the first 110 DNA exoneration cases and reported that this study failed to find a single false confession from a cognitively normal individual that did not include the use of coercive tactics by the interrogators, such as the use of physical force, denial of food, sleep, or bathroom, explicit threats of punishment, explicit promises of leniency, and extremely lengthy interrogations. In fact, Leo has testified on numerous occasions that, quote, when innocent people falsely confess, there's almost always some threat and or some promise. So threats and promises typically go together, and in the proven false confession cases, they are in a very high percentage of those cases. Leo and all false confession experts have known for decades that we have practiced, published, and taught all investigators should adhere to the following principles of practice. Always treat the subject with dignity and respect. Always conduct interviews and interrogations in accordance with the guidelines established by the courts. Do not make any promises of leniency or threats of harm or inevitable consequences. Do not conduct interrogations for an extensively lengthy period of time. Do not deny the subject any of their rights. And do not deny the subject the opportunity to satisfy their physical needs. Exercise special cautions when questioning juveniles or individuals with mental or psychological impairments, and do not physically abuse the subject or threaten to do so. So, what is Leo talking about when he says that there is substantial empirical research that the Reid method can become psychologically coercive and that the Reid behavioral interview method has been discredited? He is solely talking about a single issue, namely that academic research has reported that investigators are no better than chance, in other words, flipping a coin, at determining if a subject is truthful or deceptive based on their verbal and nonverbal behaviors during the investigative interview. So as a result, Leo suggests that investigators oftentimes end up interrogating innocent people who they have erroneously concluded were being deceptive about their possible involvement in the commission of the crime under investigation. Leo and others are trying to make the case that because Reid includes in their training programs information about evaluating a subject's verbal and nonverbal behaviors during the investigative interview, and because academic research has found that such an investigative assessment is unreliable, Reid is therefore teaching techniques that can lead to the interrogation of innocent individuals and, in some cases, false confessions. So let's take a look at what is the actual structure of the Reid investigative interview process, the behavior analysis interview, and what exactly is the academic research that Leo and others use as the basis for their assessment. The Reid behavior analysis interview is a non-accusatory, non-confrontational investigative interview that is our first contact with the subject. During the BAI, the investigator is a neutral, objective, non-judgmental fact finder. Certainly at the outset of the interview, the investigator has to be sure to comply with all legal requirements, such as the advisement of rights in custodial situations, contacting a juvenile's parents or guardian as may be required by law, etc. The BAI consists of 3 types of questions: questions about the subject's background, questions relevant to the specific issue that is under investigation, and what we call behavior-provoking questions. The background questions generally focus on biographical information about the subject and may include questions about their employment activities, or if the subject is a student, their school activities. And we may engage in conversation about a recent event, maybe a news event, a sports event, a weather issue in their area, etc. The purpose of spending several minutes early in the interview on these kinds of topics is to establish some rapport with the subject, to acclimate the subject to the interview environment, and most importantly, to establish a behavioral baseline, the subject's normal behaviors, posture, eye contact, use of illustrators, so we can look for changes from that norm later on in the interview when we get to the investigative questions. The investigative questions deal with the issue that is under investigation. One of the first questions that the investigator should ask is an open-ended question that invites the subject to tell their story. If it is a victim, what happened? If it is a witness, what did they see or hear? If it is a suspect, what were their activities on the day in question, etc. After the subject relates their initial story or version of events, the investigator will then ask a series of questions to develop additional details and to clarify the who, what, when, where, how, and why of the incident that is under investigation. The investigative questions are the core of the behavior analysis interview. They're the most important part. For example, if in a homicide investigation we ask the subject, when was the last time you saw or talked to John, the victim, and the subject says, gosh, I haven't seen or talked to John for several weeks now. And yet we have a security video that shows him entering the victim's apartment with John earlier on the day of the murder. The fact that he lied about that is incredibly important and significant. During this segment of the interview, the investigative questions, the investigator would explore for any precipitators that may have provoked the incident, procedure or policy violations that may have contributed to the situation, etc. And of course, the investigator should attempt to resolve any inconsistencies or contradictions that may have surfaced from the testimony or interviews of other subjects or the investigative information that has been developed up to this point. If the subject offers an alibi for the time period in question, every effort should be made to investigate the alibi. The investigative questions constitute the majority of the interview process. In our book, Criminal Interrogation and Confessions, we devote several chapters to the topic of investigative questions. Open-ended questions, direct questions, follow-up questions, probing questions, etc. The third type of question that we utilize in the interview is called a behavior-provoking question. These are questions that we have seen over the decades. Most truthful people tend to answer one way, while most deceptive people tend to answer them in a completely different manner. As an example, consider what we call the punishment question. Jim, what do you think should happen to the person who did this? Referring to the issue under investigation. The principle of response is that most truthful people usually offer appropriately strong punishment. So you would anticipate in a homicide investigation, most truthful people will say something to the effect he should spend the rest of his life in jail, he should never see the light of day, he should be behind bars for the rest of his life, etc. Whereas the deceptive individual who is thinking about himself may say something to the effect, well, That's kind of hard to say. I suppose it would depend on the circumstances. In criminal interrogation and confessions, we discuss numerous behavior-provoking questions that the investigator can include in the investigative interview. To illustrate the potential value of behavior-provoking questions, Johnny Reid and Associates was awarded 2 federal grants from the National Security Agency to specifically investigate behavioral differences between truthful and deceptive subjects. In these 2 studies, a total of 80 videotaped interviews of real-life actual suspects were prepared under different conditions, which allowed the evaluators to evaluate the subject's verbal, paralinguistic, and nonverbal behaviors both individually and together. When the evaluators were able to see and hear all 3 channels of communication together, their average accuracy, excluding inconclusive opinions, was 86% for truthful subjects and 83% for deceptive subjects. So clearly, much better than chance. It should be pointed out that this finding was based solely on the evaluation of 15 behavior-provoking questions and the respective answers during the interview process, that the evaluators did not see or hear any of the investigative questions and answers and were not provided with any investigative or background information. These studies were published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences. At the conclusion of the non-accusatory investigative interview, the investigator will evaluate the investigative and behavioral information developed during the interview, as well as the information, facts, and evidence developed during the investigation up to this point, and then make one of several possible decisions. The investigator may eliminate the subject from further investigation. The investigator may determine that the investigation of the subject should continue, or the investigator may decide to initiate the interrogation of the subject. So the behavior analysis interview is much more involved than Leo's description that, quote, the investigator asks 15 or 20 hypothetical questions and evaluates whether the subject is telling the truth or lying based on their answers and body language. For more information on the investigative interview process, you can review several video presentations we have on our YouTube channel, which is called the Reid Technique Tips. Preparing for the interview, proper room setting, using open-ended questions, parts 1 and 2, there is no behavior unique to lying, and the value of behavior-provoking questions. So now that you have a more complete, detailed, and accurate description of the behavior analysis interview than what was offered by Leo, let's look at the quote-unquote substantial empirical research that Leo and others say discredits the behavior analysis interview process. When Leo and others state that there is, quote, substantial empirical research that the Reid method can become psychologically coercive, and that, quote, there is a consensus in the scientific community that the techniques taught by the Reid method sometimes lead to or are involved in false confession cases, and that, quote, it's part of the generally accepted knowledge that the Reid method trains police in techniques that are associated with and believed to sometimes cause false confessions. They are referring to one singular factor, the concept of misclassification. Misclassification is a term used by social psychologists to reference the circumstance when an investigator erroneously identifies an innocent person as the guilty suspect based on their verbal and nonverbal behaviors exhibited during the investigative interview. And the social psychologists reached this conclusion based on the fact that almost all of the research studies regarding an investigator's ability to accurately assess a subject's credibility indicate that investigators cannot identify whether a person is telling the truth or being deceptive at a level better than chance, better than flipping a coin. Consequently, according to this research, Leo was suggesting that the result of this error is that investigators oftentimes interrogate an innocent person, which can lead to securing a false confession. Now, we certainly acknowledge that the vast majority of academic research studies, which are typically laboratory creations, yield very poor results as to the investigator's ability to determine whether the subject is truthful or deceptive. But you have to understand what these studies really are. Oftentimes, these studies involve a group of students, for example, college students, some of whom are asked to play the role of an innocent person, while others are asked to assume the role of a deceptive person. For example, in one study, half of the students were instructed to steal money from the professor's desk, actually walk into the professor's office, take money out of the desk drawer, put it in their pocket, and walk out. And then, when they were being interviewed as part of the investigation, lie about it, deny that they stole the money, so that the focus of the study became, can the evaluator, the interviewer, identify their deception? As you might anticipate, these kind of research studies yield very poor results as to the investigator's ability to accurately identify truthful and deceptive subjects. And the primary reason for these poor results in these types of laboratory research studies is that the vast majority of them do not mirror the context and structure of real-life interviews that are conducted by investigators in the field. Let me point out just a few of the problems with these laboratory studies that social psychologists use as the basis for their conclusions. Number one, and most importantly, the subjects, oftentimes college students, had very low levels of motivation to be believed or to avoid detection. I mean, not much was going to happen to them if they weren't successful. Whereas in real-life interviews, the consequences of not being believed or being detected as guilty can obviously be very significant. Another problem with these research studies was that there was no attempt to establish a behavioral baseline for each subject, so as to identify if there are any changes from that baseline when the subject answered questions about the issue under investigation. And furthermore, the research was based on the faulty premise that there are specific behavior symptoms that are unique to truth or deception. For example, interviewers may be advised that if the subject doesn't look at you when they answer, consider that a deceptive response. Well, there are many reasons a person may not look at us when they answer that have nothing to do with deception, from psychological well-being to distractions to cultural issues, etc. It has to be understood that there are no behaviors that are unique to truthfulness or deception. In these laboratory research studies, there was no consideration or allowance for the various factors that can affect or influence a subject's behavior, such as the seriousness of the issue, the subject's level of social responsibility, how much do they have to lose, the subject's mental capacity, their emotional or psychological well-being, their maturity, cultural influences, and their physical condition at the time of the interview. So it's not surprising at all that almost all of these studies yielded very poor results. To further illustrate these kinds of studies, one of which consisted of a number of inmates appearing on camera 2 different times, and each time describing one of the crimes that they committed. In reality, one of the stories was a true story, one of the stories was false and made up. After viewing the 2 videos for each inmate, the reviewer was then asked to determine which was the true crime story versus the false one. And the results find that most evaluators were generally very poor in being able to discern the true story from the false story, which is understandable. All they had was the monologue describing what they did by the inmate, the subject. In real-life interviews, if we're interviewing somebody about a potential crime they committed, the investigator would have engaged in conversation with the subject at the outset of the interview to develop some background information and behavioral baseline. And after the subject told us their story, we would engage them in conversation by asking questions to clarify ambiguous statements, develop additional details, clarify inconsistencies, etc. So in the real world process, where there's back and forth, give and take, exploration, undoubtedly the reviewer's accuracy in identifying the true story would significantly improve. To give you an example of how some of these social psychologists, defense lawyers, and academicians lack a basic understanding of the behavioral assessment process, consider the following. At a recent conference for defense attorneys, one of the speakers, a lawyer, was describing some of the behaviors that she said Johnny Reid and Associates teaches as being suggestive of a deceptive person. And one of the behaviors that she said Reid views as deceptive is the response, "I don't know." Now, what the attorney failed to say, or perhaps even to consider, was that all behavior must be viewed in context. If I asked you, what did you do 7 weeks ago on Thursday night between 6 p.m. and midnight, it would be completely reasonable for me to expect you to say, "I don't know." However, if I asked you if you had anything to do with killing your next door neighbor last night and you go, "I don't know," that's a whole different situation. So context is everything in the assessment of behavior. There are additional significantly important distinctions between these laboratory studies and real-life investigations. For example, in the laboratory research studies, the interviewers of the subjects were not conducted by investigators trained in interviewing techniques. The studies did not employ the type of structured interview process that is commonly utilized by investigators in the field. In these research efforts, very little consideration was given to evaluating the subject's potential involvement in the context of the investigation details based on the case facts. For example, in the mock crime case of stealing money from the professor's office, was the subject seen going into the professor's office at any time on the day in question, or was he or she off campus attending a specialized class at a sister college and had a verifiable alibi? In summary, these type of laboratory research studies actually have almost nothing in common with real-life investigative interviews or a real-life assessment of a subject's credibility. Accuracy in detecting deception with real-life suspects is significantly higher than the accuracy rate suggested by studies that use subjects who are students or inmates. And research are realizing the deficiencies in these laboratory-created research studies and are acknowledging the vital role of the investigator in using effective interviewing techniques. In a paper published that is called "Eliciting Cues to Deception and Truth, What Matters Are the Questions Asked," the authors point out that cues to deceit are faint and unreliable, which implies that the only way to improve lie detection is by eliciting and enhancing such cues. We argue that the interviewers can achieve this by using appropriate, theoretically sound interview techniques. Research efforts that more closely attempted to mirror real-life interview circumstances have demonstrated a significant increase in an investigator's ability to evaluate accurately a subject's behavior symptoms. When an investigator understands the context in which an interview is taking place, for example, the case facts and background information, accuracy in assessing a subject's behavior symptoms significantly increases. A study published in Human Communication Research by researchers at Korea University, Michigan State University, and Texas State University San Marcos found that using active questioning techniques by trained investigators of individuals suspected of wrongdoing yielded a 97.8% accuracy in detecting deception. The authors pointed out that expertise in deception detection involves actively promoting diagnostic information rather than passive behavioral observation, and that clearly the high accuracy rates are based on the fact that a subject's behavior should never be evaluated as a single determining factor, but always in context, always in conjunction with the case, facts, and evidence. Within the scope of detecting deception, there are two broad inferences that are made through behavioral observation. The first involves inferences of guilt or innocence. That is, did this person engage in this particular criminal act? And the second involves inferences of truth or deception. Namely, when the subject said such and such, was he or she telling the truth? Consider the following exchange during an interview of a suspect in an arson investigation. Have you ever thought about setting fire to your house for the insurance money? Well, sure. I think everyone's got thoughts like that. The suspect's verbal response to the investigator's question is probably 100% truthful. But the content of the response certainly infers potential guilt with respect to setting fire to his house. Research in the field of behavior symptom analysis generally indicates a higher accuracy in identifying guilt or innocence rather than truth and deception to specific statements. We practice and teach that when evaluating a suspect's behavior for detection of deception purposes, there are several essential principles that must be followed in order to increase the probability that the subsequent inferences will be accurate. Failure to recognize any of these principles increases the probability of making erroneous inferences from a subject's behavior. And it should be noted that almost none of these principles were followed in the majority of the research studies which serve as the basis for the quote-unquote substantial empirical research that Leo and others reference. Here are the principles of behavior analysis. It's critical to establish the subject's normal behavioral pattern and then look for changes from that norm through the course of the interview. Keep in mind there are no unique behaviors associated with truthfulness or deception. The investigator has to evaluate the consistency of the behaviors between all three channels of communication: verbal, paralinguistic, and nonverbal. Evaluate the preponderance of behaviors occurring throughout the interview process, not just one response, one statement, or one answer. Evaluate the potential influence of various factors on the subject, such as the seriousness of the issue, their level of social responsibility, their mental capacity, their emotional and psychological well-being, their maturity, cultural influences, and their physical condition at the time of the interview. It is interesting to note that in the federal court decision United States versus Begay, the court found that false confession theory cannot reliably determine whether a given confession is false. Additionally, the court found a further limitation on false confession science is that false confession theory does not appear to be based on significant empirical data and instead appears to be based primarily on anecdotal evidence, small sample size studies, or extrapolations from inopposite situations. In view of this discussion, social psychologists, defense attorneys, and academicians who suggest that there is a consensus in the scientific community that the techniques taught by the Reid method sometimes lead to or are involved in false confession cases are clearly being disingenuous in their statements. To underscore their hypocrisy, consider the fact that while on the one hand, Leo and others suggest that the Reid method sometimes leads to or is involved in false confession cases, and that sometimes those techniques are risk factors for false confession, while on the other hand, they use Reid as the benchmark for proper interrogation procedures. Leo has testified as a false confession expert in a number of cases in which he has stated that the police acted improperly, that they violated national standards of proper behavior, and specifically that they engaged in coercive behaviors that resulted in false confession. To bolster his opinion, he oftentimes referred to Johnny Reid and Associates as setting the national standards for proper interrogation techniques. Leo has testified that, quote, the Reid and Associates manual is sort of the Bible of interrogation in America. It was then and it is now. When he was asked what actions did the officers in this case take that you are opining violated national police interrogation standards, he responded, one would be the use of promises and threats, which Reid has been advising investigators not to do for over 60 years. He also testified that, quote, the Reid and Associates training manuals and programs have from the first edition in 1942 to the current edition in 2022 repeatedly implores police investigators not to use any interrogation technique that is apt to make an innocent person confess. So given the fact that Leo and others use Reid and Associates as the standard for proper procedures, it is clearly disingenuous to suggest that we engage and teach behaviors that cause false confessions. Thank you very much for taking a few minutes to listen to this presentation.